Islamophobia. 9/11 is we had President George W. Bush just days after 9/11 appearing at the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., making clear that whatever had happened, the United States was not and would not be at war with Islam. We saw still a number of figures start to rise up making arguments about the threat that Islam posed to the West, the sort of clash of civilizations argument that some of you have probably read, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis, a phrase which he took, by the way, from the Middle East historian Bernard Lewis. But it never, it was there, but it never really had the purchase that we've seen it in the last few years since the election of Barack Obama. With the Republicans out of power, I think a lot of people on the right felt sort of unbound to bring forward some of these very, very strident arguments about the threat that Islam poses to the West. I mean, and let's just back up. I mean, this is not to downplay the threat of terrorism or radical extremism or whatever you want to call it, but this idea that Islam in and of itself was intrinsically hostile to the West, intrinsically hostile to the values of liberal democracy, is something we've really, really seen develop over the past few years. I think it really found a new level during the Park 51 controversy in the summer of 2010, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, where you had people like Sarah Palin, if you remember Sarah Palin, Newt Gingrich and others coming out and really taking a stand against this place of worship so close to the site of the September 11th attacks. We even saw Newt Gingrich, who is now the front runner in Iowa, coming out in favor of a constitutional amendment banning Sharia law in the United States. And the Sharia law bans are a sort of instrument that this movement that we discuss in this report, I'll get to the report in a minute, have used to kind of put this into the national discussion. Not so much, it's happened at a national level, but it's been more at the state level too, and I'll get to the reasons for that in a minute. So this report, which we have over on the window, and I would encourage you to grab that on your way out, is the fruit of a better part of a year's work by my colleagues and I at the Center for American Progress. Just looking at, okay, who is saying these things, what are they saying, and how are they being funded, and how are they sort of introducing these ideas into the debate. And the good news is that it's a fairly small group of people. It's a substantial sum of money, about $40 million over the past decade. But they've been fairly effective in working on the ground in different states to kind of work with certain legislators to introduce anti-Sharia laws. We saw a referendum in Oklahoma in November of 2010. We saw another law in the Tennessee state legislature. And over 24 states now have considered in some form anti-Sharia legislation. And the kind of brains behind these measures is a man named David Yerushalmi, who's been profiled in the New York Times. I and some others were among the first to really look at Yerushalmi's role in this, and he's the guy who came up with the template legislation, which we talk about in the report, that has been copied and sort of just cut and pasted into these laws in these various states. And they've worked hard to take out some of the specific wording that might relate it specifically to Sharia law, and thereby focus on one religion over another, making it obviously unconstitutional. So just looking at the basic facts that we lay out, which are there on the first page of the report, we give a kind of an overview of what's contained in the rest of the report. $40 million over 10 years, some major foundations which we name, and a number of these foundations fund efforts across the political spectrum. And when we spoke to the people who head up these organizations, some of them weren't even clear entirely on what they were funding. Some of them clearly were. We look at some of the experts who've been behind these claims and these arguments: Frank Gaffney at the Center for Security Policy, David Yerushalmi, who I mentioned, Daniel Pipes at the Middle East Forum, based here in Philadelphia, Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch, and Stephen Emerson of the Investigative Project on Terrorism. The reach, as I said, over 24 states. It's now over 24. I think we have 23 right here in the report, but it's been up since we put out the report in August. The measures aren't meeting with that much success, but an interesting thing here is there was, as I said, a profile of David Yerushalmi in the New York Times a few months ago, and he talked about these anti-Sharia measures, and in his own words, he said if these laws had simply been adopted as written, they would not have served their purpose. The purpose, in his words, were heuristic. He wants to start a discussion about the danger of Sharia law, the danger of Islam. Now, if he really thought that Sharia law was a danger, why wouldn't he want these laws simply to be adopted as written. And I think the obvious reason is that they're trying, the people behind this that we talk about here are trying to create, they're not, their goal is to create a better political environment for very, very hawkish policies. And one of the things that tips this off for me too is there was a report put out by Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy called Team B2, the Sharia threat to America. Now, who remembers what their first Team B was? Cold War? Anybody? Oh, come on. In the late 70s, there was a group of conservatives who got together to red team, which is called Critique the CIA's Analysis of Soviet Capabilities. They argued that the CIA was vastly underestimating what the Soviets were capable of really doing with their massive military. And so they said, well, let us take a look at the raw intelligence and we will come up with a better estimate than the CIA is able to come up with. And so they did, and they came up with a report called the Team B report. And as we now know, having access to the Soviet archives after the fall of the Soviet Union, the CIA itself was massively overestimating the Soviet Union's capabilities, whereas Team B was simply science fiction. I mean, they come up with this report that was just bizarre. I mean, in one instance, they argued that there was evidence for the Soviets having a stealth submarine, and that evidence was the fact that we have not been able to find it. I'm not lying. I encourage you to go, hunt for Red October. This was their argument. We know there's a Red October out there because we can't find it. Obviously, they have a stealth submarine. So it was not, as a work of political analysis, it was extraordinarily weak, but as a work of political advocacy, it was very effective by arguing that the Soviets can do all this cool stuff. They're building all this cool equipment to come and attack us and defeat our military. Was a very effective political argument, and it managed to help pass a number of very hawkish policies. And I think by calling their report Team B2, they're sort of giving the game away that that's what's going on here. Now, just briefly, I mean, what is Sharia law? I know some of you have probably studied it, but it's a religious legal code. There are various interpretations of it. Different Muslims interpret it in different ways. Some of those interpretations are very strict, very illiberal, very cruel punishments. As in Saudi Arabia or Iran, but it's simply false to claim that that is the one true Sharia. In fact, to claim that there is one Sharia and it is the most conservative Sharia is effectively to affirm the arguments that the Taliban make or that Al-Qaeda makes about what is true Islam. The fact is, Muslims, not only in America but elsewhere in the world, interpret Sharia in a much more liberal way, and indeed it is being interpreted and reinterpreted as we sit here today. And I think, just to close, I mean, that is what I find really tragic about this effort by the people we talk about in the report, is that here in America itself, I mean, America, just the way we go about and we treat religion, we don't ban it from a public sphere, we have a fairly vigorous religious political discussion. It's here in America that Islam itself is actually, there's a certain form of liberalism obtaining within the practice of Islam here in the United States. And I think the people who promulgate this very, very anti-Islam view, actually, they disrespect America and what America has to bring to the table and what American Muslims are achieving here right now. So I'll kind of stop there for now.
Thanks, Matt. Welcome to everyone. Delighted to be here with you tonight, and I'm really happy to have this this conversation, because I think the more that we talk about it, the more useful it is to combat the very real phenomena that we're talking about tonight. The Arab American Institute was founded in 1985, specifically for the objective of achieving the political empowerment of. Sure. We were founded in I'm okay. We were founded in 1985, specifically with the mission of the political empowerment of the Arab American community. And the reason that the Institute had to be created, frankly, is that we were dealing with what we termed then in the 80s something called the Politics of Exclusion, which meant that in order for us to participate in the American political process, and as you know, if you cannot participate in the process, then you're officially disenfranchised. And participation can mean basic things like voting, but it can also mean political contributions. Our system is inherently, the role of money in politics is very key, as you all know. So we were facing in the 80s a situation where the participation of my community was considered a problem by some. It was a very narrow and zero-sum approach to politics in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict. What it meant was that for Arab Americans to be at the table, some viewed that it meant they would lose some support in the American Jewish community. Deeply flawed, no longer the case, ideally, certainly in most circles, but that was sort of the dynamic in the 80s. And we had things like political contributions being returned by candidates, Michael Dukakis. We had cases in Philadelphia here that we can spend a lot of time talking about. And that is the context by which we look at what's happening today. And I think it's important to put it in that context, in that we're familiar with the agenda, we're familiar with the proponents of this policy and what they hope to get out of it, and often the tactics that they take. So as we sort of think about what's happening today, we need to kind of understand that there is an agenda that drives this. And it's important in keeping that in mind. The new politics of exclusion today is, as I said, Islamophobia, and it's irrational fear or hatred of Muslims and Islam. We also deal with it in as the Arab American Institute in the context of an anti-Arab bias and the political marginalization. In a poll we conducted last year, 55% of Americans had an unfavorable view of Muslims, 55%. I know there's another poll that's cited more often, which is roughly 49%. Point is, it's high. I just want to point out a deep partisan divide, though, that exists with these numbers. That same 55%, if you split it between Democrats and Republicans, it was 85% among Republicans and 34% among Democrats. The bigger challenge, if you want to sort of look at it in terms of how do we frame this conversation, how do we alter this dynamic, of those that had this unfavorable view, 46% felt that they either knew everything they needed to know or they didn't want to learn anything else. So I have my perspective and I don't need to learn anything more. Again, another deep partisan divide on that I want to highlight. Of that number, Republicans 71%, Democrats 25%. I don't point this out to sort of suggest that there's a partisan agenda in play necessarily, but just to say that there is a real problem, specifically with Republican males and their perspective on when it comes to this. It's a message that's resonated well, particularly in that audience. So while the percentage of 55% is quite high, when you look at the partisan split, you realize that there really are communities where you can have a bigger impact. And when they've done polling on that, they've looked at communities, specifically young people like yourselves, across college campuses across the country. This message does not resonate well, and that's really good news. The other group in particular that doesn't seem to have this work is Catholics. Catholics, I think, having been the victims of it themselves, tend to not perceive this as something that works well. Why these views? There is obviously the fear of the unknown. When you don't know perhaps someone that is either Arab American or American Muslim, you maybe are have some misgivings or just a lack of knowledge. But I think the real reason that we're talking about this tonight is Matt's report, and that is that there really is a cottage industry that exists today to target this community and promote its political exclusion. I can't get into the value of the report is really there, but it's touched on the experts. It's touched on it talks a great deal about the funders, the grassroots organizations that exist, the media outlets that are available to them, and its effective use, whether you turn on Fox News, whether you listen to talk radio. I tend to focus on another proponent of this particular agenda, which is policymakers. It's one thing for us to sort of listen to hate speech or bigotry come from a certain source. But if it's your elected officials, folks that represent those constituents that include members of the Arab American or American Muslim community, it's a bit more challenging in that regard. As we all know, Herman Cain just left the presidential race, and he had his, one too many political controversies. But I found interesting that the reason he left at the end was not because he had decided that a loyalty oath was required for roughly 6 million Americans. That was a statement he made at a debate that at certain points received applause lines. That was fine. That was considered a sort of an acceptable discourse. There was no political price to pay when you did that. Another example I'd give you is Chairman Peter King. He convened his first hearings on the radicalization of the Muslim community, specifically a hearing looking only at that community. This is a person who, as chairman, has the power of the gavel and the budget to convene a hearing. He chose to do so on a topic that is really problematic when you think about it. This was exclusively examining one community. And this is a man whose record on these issues is not what I say, it's what he says. Direct quote, there are too many mosques in America. He didn't qualify this kind of mosque, that many no, there are too many mosques in America, period. That's sort of the perspective that he brings to it. He's bringing I think the third hearing is happening this week on Wednesday. Now he's looking at examining the radicalization of American Muslims in the military. Genuinely believes that there are groups working to infiltrate our military. I'll leave it at that. Another example to think about in the last presidential campaign, the closeted Muslim of Barack Hussein Obama. We all heard about all of that. It happened, it played out. But if you recall during that debate, when the question was asked of Senator McCain, the woman who posed the question called the president that he was an Arab, not a Muslim, misquoted it, that he was an Arab. And Senator McCain's response is really interesting because it was, no, he's not. He's a decent man. So again, what was the consequence? We were all grateful that Senator McCain did the right thing in that he called her out potentially. He sort of stopped her in the question, but no price to pay for very blatant bigotry. And the last example I would give you, because there's often a conflation of Arab and Muslim, even though the majority of Arab Americans are actually Christian and the majority of the American Muslim community are actually African American. When this gets talked about, it sort of doesn't matter, they all get conflated. Also in the 2008 campaign, Congressman Nick Rahal from West Virginia, he's a dean of the Arab American Caucus. He served in Congress for over 2 decades. Wonderful man. This last campaign cycle, they decided to take out a targeted ad against him. So ominous music, the kinds of, traditional hit pieces that you'd expect in a 30-second spot. What was the dramatic thing you were supposed to be afraid of? He's chairman of Arab Americans for Obama. That was it. So once again, we have a situation where it's the existential other. Whether it's Arab Americans or American Muslims, we're looking at a dynamic that is, these people are not like us and we need to be afraid. And it's problematic for many, many reasons, and we can get into some of that, but I emphasize the point about political disenfranchisement. One cannot have their voice effectively heard in our wonderful democracy if one can't participate. And at the end of the day, that's one of the things that happens in this regard. So the target is certainly Arab Americans and American Muslims, but secondary, I would remind us that the target is actually who we are as a nation. This is not what we're about. This is the kind of thing that doesn't resonate well, I think, among Americans. Polling numbers aside, I think it's a small, as the report is identified, it's a small fringe element that seems to have an audience for this kind of bigotry. But I think there's much to be done and much that we can do in terms of combating it. I think that would be what I would say, and then look forward to our questions and answers.
All right, now I asked them both to be brief so we could really get a discussion going. But before we talk, I have to say a couple of things. One, a lot of this comes into reports like this. There's the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania at one point did a report, a training exercise for all municipal police officers. All municipal police officers have to go through retraining once a year, and they put out this awful report on radical Islam. I mean, written by some of these people who are Islamophobes. And we see that over and over again, that our military and our police are hiring these Islamophobes to teach them about Islam. Now, I was lucky. I was working for the governor at the time. We found out about it, and we got this report nixed and removed from the training exercise. But these things actually happen. And I'm not going to say too much about the DOJ because my good friends here from the DOJ, but they have now done something because we've discovered that there were a lot of trainings going on, both by the FBI and the Department of Justice, done by these Islamophobes. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, has really stepped up to the plate and have a thorough review of all their training material. So they're not training hate. One other thing I'd like to say, because a lot of us, when we think of Muslims or Arabs, we think of the others, right? How many people here are Irish, of Irish descent? A lot of you, right? Well, I'll just tell you something interesting. Where I have a small, I teach here, but I also have a small social service agency that serves the Arabic community and mostly Muslim community in Philadelphia, the immigrant community. And it's located just north of the Northern Liberties area. I don't know if you guys know that, but it's, out in Philadelphia. Well, from where the mosque, and this is interesting, the largest Arabic mosque is in the city, within 5 blocks this way and 3 blocks that way are 2 Catholic churches, St. Michael's and St. Augustine's. And I don't know if you know, but St. Augustine Church in Philadelphia, which is at 4th and Race, is where Villanova was founded. Well, why is Villanova here, not there? Exactly, the anti-Catholic riots of 1844. So the Catholics, they burnt churches in the 1840s. And it's kind of interesting that the Muslim community in Philadelphia, the Arab Muslim community, now lives in the same area where those, Irish lived, who were considered to be the other at the time. So I want you to think about that when we think about the other. Who is the other now? And aren't we, in essence, the other, all of us? Now, I'd really like to get some discussion going, but I'm going to ask the older people not to start. I'd like to get students to be the first to ask questions. And they don't necessarily have to be my students who are there, but it always looks good. When it's my students, I get kind of happy and excited. And
when exactly would you say the start of Islamophobia really started beginning in the United States, and then exactly how much larger would it have gotten after 9/11? What would the extent before 9/11 be, and then after 9/11?
Well, I think you saw after one of the people we mentioned, Stephen Emerson. After the Oklahoma City bombing, he kind of made a name for himself by immediately going on television and insisting that this was the work of Islamic extremists. It followed all the pattern of Islamic extremists, and of course he looked really stupid when it turned out to be a white Christian dude. But he hung around. I mean, it was there, but it was, these people, Pipes, Gaffney. I mean, Gaffney's an interesting character because he was part of this kind of very hawkish, I guess you would call him a neoconservative, during the Cold War. And there's a really great article that was written by Christopher Hitchens in the early 90s where he was at a conference of some of these people, and they're all kind of looking around going, oh, the Soviet Union's gone, what are we going to do next? Where's the next big threat? And, so he kind of spent some time on China during the 90s, and then after 9/11, boom, he's like, I found it. It's Islam. But yeah, I mean, it was around, but they really came out of the woodwork after 9/11. There was a huge market for this kind of stuff. People were wondering, okay, what's going on with Islam and Islamic radicalism? And anytime there's a sort of market, you're going to have people show up and try to fill that void. But as I said, I think it was, with George W. Bush, and I just want to give him some credit for this. He did make clear after 9/11 and through the years, his policies aside, he did say a number of very important things about the role of Muslims in America, how, American citizenship. But I think when he left office, the conservative movement and Republicans tended to feel less bound by that leadership. And I think there has been an attempt to use this sort of othering as a kind of side door way to sort of alienate Barack Obama, to suggest that he's not really American. You see a number of different efforts around this, but I think Islamophobia has been one.
One question? By the way, just to show another Republican who's been, we don't want to be biased here, but another Republican who's been very good on this issue has been Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, who has said he appointed somebody as a judge who's a Muslim, and he was attacked by Pam Geller. And he said, oh, he called them crazies. I'm not going to deal with those crazies. So for all, whether you like Christie or not, he's been very good on this issue. Okay, you're almost a student.
I have a question about the agenda behind Islamophobia. I hear you saying a few different things. And one, is this part of the one-term presidency argument that the fanning the flames of Islamophobia helps get Barack Obama out? Is there a link to a Zionist agenda? Fanning the flames of Islamophobia leads to supporting the Israel lobby? Is there a military-industrial complex thing going on? Fanning the flames is a sort of a post-Cold War, we can now focus military efforts against Islamic societies. I mean, what exactly is this agenda? What is to be gained politically by being an Islamophobe?
You want to take a first crack, or
I think you'll get two different answers, From my perspective is when I refer to a political agenda, I'm bringing it back to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and there is, I think on the most basic level, it is a vehicle to get at the president. This closeted Muslim worked effectively. It's not a coincidence that Park 51 became a wedge issue in the 2008 campaign, and the timing of that. It was a way to encourage voters to sort of look at him in a different way and just wonder and raise some questions. And that's an unfortunate thing, but that was part of what transpired. And I think at the end of the day, you'll do whatever it takes to be effective in that regard. So that's one piece of it. But the Arab-Israeli conflict piece is certainly there. And I think, I just think it's would be disingenuous not to say that that's a portion of what happens here. It's the reason that I talk about the politics of exclusion in the 80s. It was we talk about Oslo and in terms of how much it failed, the Oslo peace process, in terms of how much it might have failed in changing facts on the ground in either Israel or Palestine. But in reality, it changed the dynamic in the United States tremendously. Arab Americans and American Jewish groups worked together in support of a peace process during the 90s in a way that they hadn't during the 80s. And that changed the political discourse tremendously in Washington. So I think that's one of the reasons that the politics of exclusion failed. It's an old paradigm to talk about it as one versus the other. It's a zero-sum approach, and it doesn't work. And I think what we have now is some of those same players are sort of back at the table with a very narrowly minded approach to it. I think one that doesn't help anyone, frankly, including, even the most pro-Israel agenda wants to be effective. I don't think this is effective in doing that. But so from my perspective, that is certainly a component here. But I think it would start with the very simple base politics. How do you attack a candidate so that we can win? And if this has a potential of working, I'll use it.
Right. I think it's good to compare these sorts of measures and this discourse with the kind of social conservative stuff that was used in the 2004 campaign, like gay marriage. It was used as kind of a base turnout mechanism, and we're not seeing as many referenda this time around. But just doing this stuff at the state level as a way to kind of just cultivate this sort of fear. Okay, what's going on here? I need to address this at the ballot box. A way to just kind of turn the base out and create a better political environment for conservatives, frankly. I think, as Maya said, I think, unfortunately, there is, a small faction of the American Zionist community that does see this in very zero-sum terms, and the political empowerment of American Muslims is threatening to them. I would stress, I think this is a minority. I think mainstream Jewish groups have been very good about pushing back on this stuff and, working together with, different faith leaders to push back on this. And the defense industry as well. Going back to Frank Gaffney, this is his thing. It's all about the funding. It's whatever's hot in the news, he's about. As I said, in the 90s, after the Soviet Union fell, it was China. Then after 9/11, he was all about the Wahhabis, and now it's the Muslim Brotherhood. So he's like, oh, the Muslim Brotherhood is the real thing. And next year when the latest threat comes up, that's what will be at our doorstep. I'm quite sure.
Well, which is very interesting. We were talking about the ADL, Abe Foxman, who's, a very, I would say, center-right Jewish American official, is actually very much against this Islamophobia thing and spoken out against it. And Frank, was it Spencer or Gaffney who called him a stealth jihadist?
Right. No.
Abe Foxman.
No,
Abe Foxman, a stealth jihadist?
They put out a very good backgrounder on David Yerushalmi on the ADL did.
Right.
And in a piece I wrote, I challenged, some of these characters, saying, here's Abe Foxman repeating what I'm saying. Are they part of the stealth jihad too? And they came back, yes.
You mentioned earlier Newt Gingrich said something about something very anti-Sharia law.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, are there actually people trying to make Sharia law into a national or incorporate it into the law we have right now?
The short answer is no.
That's what I thought. So where's he basing it? Is it just the fear mongering, or does he have some kind of basis for this?
Well, not really. Gingrich is just kind of clever at jumping on to whatever's hot at the moment. And when Gingrich said that, it was kind of the height of the Park 51 controversy, and I think it was July or August 2010, and he gave a speech at the American Enterprise Institute where he just stressed, yes, this is very important that we ban Sharia law from our Constitution. As we talk about in the report, this legislation, the U.S. Constitution already protects every American citizen from any sort of law, whether it's domestic or foreign, that violates their constitutional rights. So the idea that secretly, Sharia law is going to be applied here is simply it's ridiculous on its face.
But as Matt said, we're looking at 24, 25 different states that have either introduced it or passed it. And when he started this effort, it mentioned Sharia law by name in terms of the bills that were being introduced. Now it's been augmented so that it doesn't refer to it specifically, but still attempts to, at a most base level, make us very afraid.
And in Pennsylvania, you have a state representative, Darrell Metcalf, who is from, I forgot what county, but one of those out in the west somewhere, who has been very strong anti-Muslim and has proposed various things that hasn't gone out of committee, but to ban Sharia law in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, it's here. It didn't go anywhere, but it's been discussed here. The interesting thing is the same people who are anti-Sharia law are also bringing up stuff like anchor babies and, you know, English as the official language. You see them also bringing those issues up. And Daryl and Metcalf had a series of hearings that of his bill, which would require English to be the official language of Pennsylvania. And that doesn't make sense because, I mean, we actually have another language group in Pennsylvania for hundreds of years, and that's the Pennsylvania Duss, who are allowed to teach their kids in German. So, but I don't think they have a problem with that.
This year there was the controversy with the 9/11 memorial coloring book. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where it had like the 9/11 ruins and a bunch of men in turbans, and it was sold. They sold a lot of copies to children. So when
Yeah, I remember this, but tell me the specifics again.
well, they had like the one picture for children to color in was Osama bin Laden's wife, like blocking him as the bullet rushed towards him. And then they had the 9/11 ruins with like men in turbans all around. So my question is, how is Islamophobia present in our society outside of the political arena?
That's a great question. I'll just briefly and then turn it to Maya. It's little things like that. Who's going to notice that? I mean, someone found it, was offended by it, and on one hand, okay, how offensive is it? But it just kind of creates this sense at a very young age that this is the threat: people in turbans, people who are Muslim. But I think our culture has gotten, even as this specific problem, these activists has gotten louder. I think in general, you still find representations of Arabs and Muslims as terrorists, whether it's 24. But I think shows like 24. But it's gotten much more diverse as the American experience and knowledge of Muslim Americans has gotten much more diverse. There's nothing. My favorite example probably of all time is Back to the Future. If you remember Back to the Future, the Libyans, from whom am I getting blank stares? Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Back to the Future. Okay, I love this. The Libyans from whom Dr. Brown got the plutonium are driving around with their keffiyehs on. Just these ideas of these AK-47 wielding terrorists driving around suburban America in a Volkswagen van. It's gotten better than that, but it's still around. But again, I mean, those subtle kinds of signals kind of prepare people at a young age to believe the worst about their Muslim fellow Americans.
I think that's a really great question, actually, and thankfully I'm not familiar with the coloring book and will not look for it. I would add that the importance of understanding that whether it's a public official that makes a statement or whether it's a hate group, that words matter. The first victims of hate crimes post 9/11 were actually Sikhs. Because of their turbans, they weren't Muslim, but ignorance obviously can't distinguish. We've seen it manifest itself in a very real way in elementary schools in particular, in terms of bullying of young children, and the Department of Education has taken that very seriously and instituted programs to address this stuff. So it's those. I haven't thought much about it because we spend a lot of time dealing with public officials and trying to check that, but that's a very important component to this. I would say on the upside that there have been a lot of new ways in which Americans are learning about Muslims and Arab Americans in a very positive way. If you're familiar, there's something called the Axis of Evil comedy tour, where basically they're Muslim comedians who have toured the country doing paid shows, sold out paid shows, have done really well. And I think once you have the ability to laugh at something, it's sort of a transformative moment, and that's been tremendously helpful. Because of how well that's gone, they've actually raised money separately and have toured different parts of the country, let's say, where folks might be less receptive to their particular type of comedy, and they've done those shows for free. And that, too, has been a very important part of sort of increasing that kind of outreach and education.
I don't know much about Sharia law, so I'm sorry if the answer to this question is obvious, but I was wondering if there's any similarity between it and like Christian church discipline, such that the way that these laws are trying to be crafted would eventually have implications for other faith groups practicing discipline in their own ways, or if it's so distinct that it really can be just applied to this specific community.
I think a better, it's difficult because there's really no comparison to the Catholic, the Pope or the Vatican in Islam. I think a better comparison would probably be to halakhic law in Judaism, where there is a discourse, there are religious legal scholars who struggle with the text and interpret it for their own communities, and there are differences in various communities around the world. I think there's a similarity there. You can't go to the store and buy halakha. You can't go to a store and just buy Sharia. You can get books that describe what the process is and what the code is about, trying to describe right religious practice for the faithful. But I would say that's a better comparison. But I mean, even just for Catholicism and for Christianity, more generally, I mean, there are things that the Bible says that many Christians do, you choose to and choose not to observe as they find appropriate.
So then do the laws against Sharia laws say things like a religious community can't discipline its own members, or tell them what to think about this issue or that? Or like, how could it be tailored specifically to one faith group and not another?
Right. I mean, it can under the U.S. Constitution. I mean, first of all, for a religious community to punish its members in a way that violates that member's rights under the Constitution is itself unacceptable. You don't even need a law for that. But there just references to Sharia. We won't we hereby. I mean, there's examples of the language here in this report. At first, as in Oklahoma and in Tennessee, it referenced Sharia specifically, but as those have been challenged, they've kind of taken out any specific reference and just said any foreign law will not be applicable. But as I said, that's completely extraneous, because any foreign law, or any domestic law for that matter, that violates an American's rights under the Constitution is illegal in the first place. But it has created a number of concerns from other groups, like business groups, that have said, okay, the way this law is written now, it might prohibit us from contracting with foreign companies who are working under their laws, and it might raise problems with adjudicating disagreements or contract issues here in the United States, because we are, by definition, kind of dealing with a set of foreign laws. There are Native American groups that have said, okay, what does this mean for our tribal laws, which for, all intents and purposes under the way these new laws are written could call our laws foreign laws. One other one is laws relating to the return of kidnapped children, or children who have been taken out of the country, and and returning these children involves negotiating and dealing with foreign laws as that might apply. So I mean, these are just a few of the groups that have raised issues with this.
But I have to. It's a good question. But I also add the point that it's sort of interesting that we're even talking about this. You recall the first tag word that appeared on the scene was madrasas. We were all supposed to be really afraid of madrasas, which is like the Arabic word for schools. Then it shifted to jihad, which we were supposed to understand meant holy war, right? It means struggle. I can have a personal jihad against 20 pounds, and that doesn't make the news, right? I mean, that's not, we don't interpret things that way. Then this latest thing with Sharia is it's not like Muslims sit around talking about, Sharia it comes up in matters of marriage and death, of like no interest loans, because you're not allowed to, technically, if you're very observant, you don't allow, borrowing money and charging interest is not okay. So it's fascinating to think about these issues as part of our national discourse now, because for any member of the American Muslim community, that's just bizarre. I mean, that's not what we sit around and talk. How is that's what our fellow Americans are now sort of spending all this time and energy fighting and dealing with, to the point of, nearly, I think it's 27. I said 25, but I think it's 27 states.
Right. No, it's funny. I was raised a practicing Christian. I go somewhat regularly now, but in the past 3 years, I've discussed Sharia law in far greater detail than I ever discussed, Christian law or whatever term you want to use, even though I was living it. It was just a kind of lived experience.
Just a point of clarification, these laws, I heard you guys mention legislation against foreign laws, and how other groups like maybe Americans might be concerned about this. So is that what it is? That the legislation is against any law that is not by our government? Or
Right, it just says, you know, any prohibits the application of any foreign law that would violate the rights of, you know, anyone in this state. But it's written in such a way that it could be interpreted, you know, just saying, you know, it could create a problem. I mean, as I said, that function is already fulfilled.
Right.
But it does create an opportunity if a lawmaker or a governor or a legislator chose to interpret in such a way to go even farther to specifically target those laws or Sharia law, which is of course the purpose. They could.
And it didn't start that way. It started specifically mentioning Sharia law. It's only because they've adapted their strategy to kind of alter it now. And as Matt said, like for example, I'm from Michigan, the Michigan law, we have a border, international border with Windsor in Canada. People are looking at the language which doesn't note Sharia and sort of saying, wait a minute, there are tons of cross-border business transactions. How would this impact that? So one of the biggest proponents fighting it in Michigan had been the business communities just saying, this makes no sense to us, and it's very problematic. So. But the agenda is this.
But no, that part I understood. I just didn't. I thought it really specifically saying, you know, this is Sharia law and we're making legislation against that.
Right. No, I mean, you're right to be confused. I'm kind of confused. I've actually spoken to some of these people. Like, describe for me the process by which Sharia law becomes the law of the United States, and I have yet to hear a real explanation about how this happens.
I understood it. Like, there's different kinds of Sharia law, and there's different things. There's some things that are more broad, and some things that are very specific. And
Right.
certain communities.
But you're only saying that because you're part of the conspiracy. That's what we all need to understand. Okay.
You know, I remember 2 years ago, the 9th anniversary of 9/11, it was almost a high point of the anti-Sharia law, anti-Part 51. I mean, anywhere you look, they were talking about burning Qurans. Do you remember that nutty Pastor Jones?
Yes.
And it was really awful. I mean, and I'm scratching my head and saying, what's happened to America? Interesting, this year it wasn't a big issue. So we actually organized against the 9th anniversary. We got a bunch of Muslim imams, we got some Catholic bishops, we got some rabbis. The governor at the time, Rendell, got us all together at Independence Hall to talk about religious interfaith diversity, cooperation, etc. This year it wasn't big at all. And my feeling is, well, why was 2 years ago big, this year not? And let me answer that. I think next year will be again, because I think it's totally a wedge issue created to galvanize people to go to the vote, to vote against, in this case, the evil Muslim president, or other people like that. So I'm really concerned about next fall how this issue is going to play itself out.
Excuse me, as things are now, will courts allow Muslim witnesses, excuse me, to swear in on the Quran? As things are now, and would this anti-Sharia law stop that? I've heard of...
Let me give you I am, in my other life, I'm an administrative law judge. I was chairman of the State Civil Service Commission. I still hear cases. We swear or affirm anybody, and I've had Muslims, there's a Bible there because I think it's always been there, but I think I would have, and I think from everyone I know who also serves in those capacities, would not have a problem with swearing or affirming anybody in under anything. So I think, I don't know how that plays, but I think you do have the right. And Bob, do you know anything on that? I mean, you're DOJ, somewhat deal with it. U.S. Attorney's Office.
I guess the answer is that my experience is that you really, sometimes they'll say put your hand on the Bible and then do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. I'm sure that it can be amended, and if a person said I don't believe in the Bible, I believe in the Quran, the critical thing is, do you agree to tell the truth, and you understand that there are penalties of perjury that flow from a false statement?
You know, I think it's a nice opportunity, though, to mention this. it's your question. I literally thought to myself right now, like, wait a minute, when you swore in that one time, what was it on? And I can honestly tell you that I'm sure I swore on the Bible, and that doesn't matter because it's a holy book, and Islam views there are more mentions of the Prophet Jesus Christ in the Quran than not. So it's one of those things where there's no issue with that per se. But the second thing, if you guys remember, the first member of Congress, the first Muslim member of Congress that was elected in 2006 or 8?
That was 06, yeah.
06, okay. I think it's 6. I'm not good with dates. Congressman Keith Ellison from Minnesota. And he chose to take his oath on a Quran. And
They don't take an oath on the Quran. That was a
I'm
ceremonial.
sorry, the swearing in. He said he chose to be sworn in on the Quran. But the Quran he chose was Thomas Jefferson's Quran. So I think it's an important reminder when we talk about these things that Thomas Jefferson, we're in Philadelphia. So it's not one of those things where like it's this alien other document. It's not a, it's a normal thing. Just add that.
Any other questions?
Easy crowd.
This is easy. What I'll urge you to do, how many people here have, and this is something maybe we have Lowell Gustafson in the back, who's the head of the Center for Arab Islamic Studies. How many, what I'm thinking right now off the top of my head, Lowell, and I always get you in trouble for this, how many people here have been to a mosque? Oh, so quite a few. What we could do if students are interested, as from the Center of Arab Islamic Studies, is have a trip. We can get a bus and go to a mosque and meet with people, just so you understand that these people aren't any different than you or I. Is this something people would be interested in doing? Some of you? Yes? Wave? Okay. I'm thinking of something like this. Maybe on a, we can, what do you think, Lowell? Good idea? We could do that to kind of get, just let people know that, and there's one literally not even a mile from here. So at it's called the Islamic Center of the Delaware Valley. So Foundation for Islamic Studies, right. All right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. There are more book studies up here. I'd like to thank our two guests.